Hello everyone, welcome to this demo on how to use Camera Raw, which is a software that comes with Adobe Photoshop. So you might have used Photoshop before, but you might have not noticed Adobe Camera Raw because you might not have used a camera that gives you a raw file format, which is the one that you will use when you're opening up Camera Raw usually. And I'll go into that in a little bit. So first of all, what is Camera Raw? So Camera Raw is a software that serves as a processor to convert the raw data from your camera to another file format. You can either convert the file into a JPEG, TIFF, and I have other options that I will show you in a little bit. But you can also open the raw file by processing it in Camera Raw and then opening it up in Adobe Photoshop. And I'm going to show you how to do that right now on this demo. The reason why we shoot Camera Raw or raw format is because it gives you a lot more data on your file than what a compressed file will give you, which is normally a JPEG in standard cameras. So a JPEG format, basically what it means is that that file format has been compressed into a format that is more generally used. So that way you can email it to people, upload it to the website. So it's a more common file format, which is compressed, and it loses quality over time. Now, a raw format is basically that raw data that the camera captures without being converted into a smaller file size. So why do we use Camera Raw? So the reason is because the camera is giving you a bigger file format that has more information in it, you're basically doing changes to that file before converting it into a JPEG. So that means that if the file is a little bit dark, you have more data there to push it to make it brighter. You have more dynamic range. You have more detail in that file because it's having the raw data from your camera. Now, some of you might have a camera and you're shooting images and you're pleased with the image that it gives you. However, that file format that you have, that JPEG, is actually a file that is being converted inside your camera. So the camera has like a CPU, a computer inside, that when the camera takes a picture, it's recorded and that CPU converts that file format into a JPEG. Now, Camera Raw is included in Photoshop and it's giving you that capability of making adjustments before converting your file, which is great. And you're going to see why in a little bit. So I have these files here, and the first thing is to identify what is a raw file when you see it. So I have here a couple files. This one is from a Canon camera, and you will see that the extension at the end is .cr2. What that means is that that file format is a raw file. Okay, it's not a normal compressed JPEG file. Now, depending on the camera that you use, that extension at the end might be different. You can see that this one here is a DNG, so that's a digital negative file. It also contains a lot of information that you can process in a Camera Raw file format. Now, if I would have a JPEG here in Adobe Bridge and I would double click it, it will automatically open inside Adobe Photoshop. However, if you double click on this file, and I'm going to do it one as a sample, if I double click on this one, because it's a raw format, it will automatically open in Camera Raw. So this is Camera Raw right here. So if you ever see this window when you're opening a file, the chances are that you were clicking a file that is a raw format, okay? Or it could be a JPEG that you open in Camera Raw, and I'm going to show you a workaround on how to open a JPEG, and you made some changes so it already knows that you opened it in Camera Raw, so it will open also in Camera Raw, but that's more rare. So I'm going to close this because I actually want to open all of these at once, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So instead of opening one by one, I'm going to do Command A so I can select all of my images inside here. And once I select all of these images, I'm going to click, it doesn't matter which one I click, I'm going to double click in one of them, and it will open all of them in Camera Raw, and you will see that they will open up at the bottom. Okay, so once you have your files here, I want to first kind of walk you through all the different areas. So at the bottom, you have a film strip that basically is going to show you all your images. you can have multiple images all the way, extending here. You can open 100 or 1000, and you would just scroll through them at the bottom of this film strip. You can also hide that film strip. You can see basically only your file size. I'm doing the backslash that is next to the shift on a Mac. That tab is basically going to give you that capability of hiding or seeing all your files. And you can do also that in this little icon right here. I'm going to zoom in so you can see it. It's at the bottom right here. It has like the little thumbnails at the bottom and the arrow. So if you click there, you can go through it. And in case you know that you're opening multiple files and they don't show up, it might be that you have this close up. Okay. So that's a pretty cool thing to have because you can see all your images here. You have this big canvas that has your image that you have selected. So if I click on a different image, that preview is going to change to my next image. So depending on what thumbnail you click at the bottom, you will have the image on the top. Now I'm going to move to the right side here. Okay, and this one right here, it gives you a histogram. Okay, that is basically the x-ray of your photograph. How this works is the left side all the way at the end here are the darkest areas of your image. And all the way on the right is the really highlights parts of your image. So all the white areas. Then you have highlights, then you have midtones, and then you have shadows, and then the dark areas. So you can tell by looking at this graph that this image has mostly midtones and highlights. There's a little bit of shadow here on this area, but it doesn't have a lot of dark. It doesn't have like super bright areas. And that is, if we look at this image here, the very bright areas would be here in that area right here that doesn't have a lot. And the darkest would probably be like some of these branches here in this area. Okay, so there's not a lot of pure black. So this can be a good resource to use when you're adjusting your images because this will move according to your adjustments. So I'm going to hide some of these so it will look similar to when you open yours. And that also gives you the information at the bottom of what ISO you use, what lens you had in, what f-stop you had, and how much was your shutter speed. So this is really useful to remember, what camera settings you use in your camera. They also have some edits that are auto, black and white, HDR. I'm not going to go over those because those are self-explanatory. They're just automatic. But I rather have you go down here where you're going to be editing your image custom to your liking. Okay, so these tabs, they open up. You can see that there's this little arrow here that if you click there, I right click, it will drop down this so you can have the options in there. And I like having them all closed down and only having open the one that I'm currently working on. Now you will see when I open this one, it already has some settings, and that's because this image I had already previously edited on my previous video. And the reason I'm doing a new video is because Adobe Photoshop changed this year how Camera Raw looks. I already have one uploaded on YouTube. So if you happen to see that one first, it's not a big deal. The only thing that they changed is that these names are different. Now they divided it by light, color, effects, so that kind of stuff. But the settings are the same, and the menus basically work the same. The only thing that changed is just the drop-down menus, the name of them. Okay, so if you saw my previous video, don't worry, you don't have to rewatch this one. So you basically can stop. The only thing that you have to know is that this column here changed some of the names, but in how they work, it's exactly the same way. Okay, so I'm gonna first go back because I want to show you something. I'm gonna go and click cancel and go back here. And the reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to take this opportunity to show you what is the advantage of shooting Camera Raw. So you can see that these little icons right here on the top right of your files, all of the files have that because I already edited them in the previous video. What that means is that these files have already been edited in Camera Raw. The cool thing about that is if I open, for example, these files and I go to that image, I can readjust the settings, okay? And if I click done at the bottom, those settings will be saved. In this case, I actually don't want that. So I'm actually going to take the opportunity to reset this. And this is a good learning, moment for you. If you ever want to reset your files all at once, I have them all selected. I'm going to right click on top of one of them. And then I'm going to go here to develop settings and then clear settings. Okay, so I'm going to do that again. I'm going to go to develop settings all the way down here to clear settings. When I do that, you will see that all the settings went away and all my images are changing to the original state that I took them. Okay. Now I'm going to double click again in here so I can go to Adobe Camera Raw. And now you will see that the settings are at 0. The reason why I did that is because I actually want to walk you through the steps on how to enhance these images, so that way you can do the same when you do the lab. So now that I'm here on the first image, I have the first one selected. I'm going to start editing these images. Remember, the first thing that we did was look at the histogram. We moved down. We are not going to change the Adobe color profile. There are some presets that you can do. So for example, if I click landscape, it will make some adjustments for landscape, which is helpful. It gives you a good starting point, so you can kind of play around with that. But that's basically the basic one. That's Adobe color. This is a profile that's supposed to enhance the image more for landscape. We can leave it there for now. Now, this one, the light one, is basically anything that's brightening it up, contrast, density to your image. That's what we're going to be doing here. And that's a clever thing that Adobe did, because now they're separating it. Instead of having color mix, now it's just light. One tab is for color. It's more, separated from all these tabs, and it makes more sense. So I'm going to start with the exposure. The cool thing about Camera Raw is that you can go all the way, and push your image a lot more than you can with the JPEG. However, my suggestion every time that I start with students learning how to use either Camera Raw or Lightroom is that you don't want to be at the edges. Okay, it doesn't matter which setting, you don't want to be all the way at the edges. However, because it doesn't ruin your file, you can always go back. I do encourage people to kind of push it and see what you can do with that, and then bring it back down. So go really far and then see what it does, and then move it to an area that you feel satisfied with. Okay, so exposure, I'm not going to start with a lot, because usually I put a little bit if it needs it, but I don't go with a lot because I'm going to be moving the other ones, which might affect how the image looks, and I might want to go back to exposure at the end. So contrast, I always put a little bit just to see. Highlights is one that is really helpful, it's particularly in this image because you have a lot of light in the sky, and then this is a little bit more of a shadow. So I want to bring down the highlights here without affecting this one. So this one will be a good one. So I'm going to go to all the way to the edge so you can see what it does. That's like the highlights. You can see a lot of the clouds now, the sky. If you want to bring it back to 0, you can double click it and it goes back to 0. Okay. But you can see how the sky, there was information there, but it was not that visible. As soon as I go here, those clouds kind of pop, and even the color of it starts becoming more vibrant. So the one thing I want to, point out is that I would not do this all the way to the end. I actually would, somewhere, if you want to push it, somewhere in the middle is a good place to start with, somewhere around there, but don't go all the way to the end. You don't want to push it too much because then it starts creating weird artifacts on the sky. So I don't want to push it all the way. Shadow, the same thing. The shadow is going to be more around this area. So as soon as I push this to the right, you will see that the rocks become brighter, the plants become brighter, but the sky is not being affected, which is pretty cool. Then I have the whites, which I'm going to bring down to see if the sky gets a little bit darker. And then the blacks, I'm going to make them a little darker to the left, so that way the rocks in the areas that is dark, it becomes a little bit more contrast. So the blacks and the whites, if you move them, it kind of behaves the same as contrast. You're adding contrast by lowering, the blacks, and if you push the whites, it will kind of add contrast. So in this case, I actually want to bring the whites down because I want more detail on the sky. And then the blacks, I'm also going to lower them to make sure that it's dark, because I'm actually going to push a little bit the shadows, so the rocks become brighter, and the highlights, I'm going to push them down a little bit. So we have done only adjustments under light. I'm going to give you a before and after, which you can do on these little 2 symbols will give you changes. This one on the left, you can actually scroll through the settings so you can see how it looks side to side. You can divide it, like this. So this is the after. The one on the left side, you can see on the top here, it tells you before and after. You can also go like this, top to bottom, or like that. So you can basically go through them. The one that I like to use is this one, but not with that. This one is just a before and after. I like using the shortcut, which is the / right next to the bracket keys. So that's the before, that's after. that already is looking a lot better. You can see that the sky looks really interesting. The detail on the rocks and the dirt area in the foreground became more clear. So that's pretty good so far, and we have only adjusted one of them. Okay, so I'm going to hide this one. I'm going to go to color. Now, white balance is going to be really helpful because sometimes you're shooting and you forgot to change the white balance in your camera. The cool thing about shooting camera raw is that you can change it after the fact. So if you by accident had like tungsten and then your colors look really blue or something like that, it doesn't matter because you can go here and pick, daylight if it was daylight. Obviously, this is not pure daylight because the sunset already happened. But you get the idea that depending on the setting, we can change it. You can also try auto, see how it looks. That's a good starting point. And then if you don't like it, you can go to temperature, which is the next setting, and you can push it warmer or cooler, depending on what you like. I'm going to go with warmer on this image so you could bring more of the detail and the color of the plants in the foreground. Now, you're going to see this little icon here. That's the white balance tool. I'm going to go over that one later, but I just want to point it out so you don't think that I, forgot about it. But I'm going to explain later because this image doesn't have a good area to click for that tool, and I'm going to show you later what it does. Same thing with the tint. You can basically see if you want more green or more magenta in your image depending on the settings of that scenario. And then vibrancy basically brings the more muted tones a little bit more vibrant, all the tones. Now the saturation makes everything saturated, which I'm a little bit more careful with the saturation. I feel like vibrance is a little subtle, which I like. The saturation can become like, if I push this all the way, you can see that it's saturating everything too much for me. But some people like that. I just not my style. So I try to keep the saturation very low, or usually I just keep it on 0. And then the vibrance, I might bring it up a little bit because it does something nice to the sky sometimes. So let's just leave it there for now. I'm going to hide this one. I'm going to do a preview again by pressing the slash key. So that's before, after. Look at that difference. Pretty nice so far, right? So that's the color. Now I'm going to go to effects. This one, you can think about it kind of like sharpening your image, but not really. Most of these, what they do is they add contrast either by, creating some effect in the edges of things, or in overall the image creating some more contrast overall to give you that texture. So that's the first one I'm going to start with, which is just gives you texture. I'm going to exaggerate it so you can see what it does. You can see that it looks really contrasty, the image right now. So what it's doing is creating more contrast at the edges of everything. Okay. Now that is not one that I'm, particularly fond of. I don't use it as much. I sometimes, do a little bit, but the one that I use more is the one that says clarity. This one right here. I think it's a little bit more subtle. And it gives you the illusion that the image is sharper, which I like. But again, I don't use it a lot because if you push it too much, it looks kind of weird. But you can see that if I go to the opposite side, it also softens your image, which might be a cool effect that you might be looking for if you want your image to have like this little soft glow to it. But I'm going to do like 5 just to give it a little bit. The haze works great in some scenarios if there's a lot of haze. If you're shooting underwater photography, this is a good one to use. And it also, again, it kind of takes away that contrast. It adds contrast to your image, making, those midtones kind of disappear a little bit, which is pretty useful in some scenarios. The vignette basically is the edges of your image. You can decide if you want a little bit of vignette. Obviously, this is exaggerated. I just want to show you how it looks. But you can also do a little bit. You can do the opposite where it brightens it up. There are some cameras and lenses that might create a natural vignette in your image, and this might be a way that you can like take it off if you see that the edges are a little bit dark on your image. I'm going to keep it at 0 on this image, and then the grain will also give you, that film kind of effect of grain to your image. But again, I don't want that one here, so I'm going to take it off. You will see that there is a drop-down menu on these. There's that little arrow. So if you see that one, and that means that you can do further adjustments. For example, in the vignette, you can affect the roundness of it. You can affect how soft it is. you know, if you want it a little bit softer. The midpoint, like if you want it really at the edges or go a little bit more in the middle. Let's exaggerate this to the other side so you can see what I did. So midpoint is like if you want it right in the middle, more on the outer. If you want the feather is how soft it is. So if you can have like a circle like that, or you can feather it up and have a little bit more transition or gradient between the dark and the non area that's being affected. Okay, so that's something that I'm going to take away because I don't need it in that image. And then you have some more specific adjustments like curve, color mixer. These ones are some that, because we're going to cover it in Photoshop later on, I'm not going to go over it, but it gives you a similar effect to what you did here by adjusting the highlights and the shadows and the white and the blacks. So in this one, you know, if for example highlights, if you push it up, you can see that it goes up here on the curve. And if you take it down, it makes it darker on the highlights. But the cool thing about this one is that instead of, you know, just doing the sliders, you can also add dots to your image and then do it manually by lowering it there. So this graph, what it represents, it goes again from the black all the way to white. These are the midtones, highlights, shadows. So you can basically go directly into the graph and adjust it how you want. But I'm going to explain that later on in Photoshop. So I'm going to not do it right now. I'm going to bring all these back to 0. Again, you double click it and brings them to 0. And then color mixer, you can also play with that with the colors, but I'm going to go over that in Photoshop. And then you have color grading, which is useful because Photoshop doesn't have this inside of it. So you can adjust the colors not only generally. In this one, what you can do in the color grading is that you can adjust it on shadows or highlights or the midtones separately. So for example, if I want my shadows to be a little bit warmer, I can push this to the right, and kind of get the shadows warmer without affecting the highlights, or vice versa. Let's say that I want, you know, the highlights to be warmer. I can go here to the right, make the highlights warmer, or I can make them cooler if I want. But in this case, I feel like it will look better. Leaving that one and then making the shadows a little bit warmer, so that way shadows don't look blue on my image. The same thing you can do with the midtones. You can adjust that one. You can also adjust, you know, the brightness of it or the intensity, the luminosity. Let's say that's what the L is here. That's for luminosity, okay? And this one is basically the hue that's being affected. So that is what this one does. It's really helpful, but again, it's going to vary depending on your image. So you might have to kind of experiment a little bit and see what works best for your photograph, depending on what colors you have and how it looks. Now, detail is to sharpen your image. What you want to do on this one, I'm going to minimize it because usually it's like this. I don't want to go all the way to the edge because look at how it looks. I don't know if you can see, I'm going to zoom in. What it's doing is adding contrast. That's why you get those little pixels around the image, okay? That is what it's doing. It's basically enhancing the contrast, but it can look really weird at the edges. So you don't want all the way at the end. Sometime, if I don't know what I want, I usually do somewhere around 80. That seems to be good enough. Somewhere between 50 and 80 seems to be good. If you want more, I would go, you know, in the 90s or 100 if you want to push it. But I usually never go over 100 in my images. Now, the cool thing about this is that it has this little arrow that I just click. All right, so this one collapses it, or you can click it and it will expand it down. And these settings here you can play with, but I usually leave them how they are. So you can leave the radius and the detail, but the masking is really helpful because what that one will give you is a preview of what areas are going to get sharpened. Okay, so right now I'm sharpening at 100%, but my entire image is being sharpened, including the sky. And I actually don't want to sharpen the sky because I want the sky to stay soft. So the way that you're going to change that is by pressing Option on your keyboard, clicking here, and you're going to drag it to the right. Now, you have to hold Option because if you don't hold Option, this is how it looks. And then you're like, what is this doing? There's no preview of what it's doing. But if you hold Option and you click on the masking and push it to the right, it shows you what's being sharpened by making that area white. So whatever is white right now is what's going to get sharpened. You can see that the sky is black. So that means that it's not going to get sharpened at all. So that's pretty cool because if you leave it down, your entire image is white. I mean, it's sharpening everything. And then as you push it to the right, you can see what you want sharpened. And I actually just want the rock. So I'm going to keep it all the way to the right here. So something like that, and 90. So now my sky is staying soft, but then all this area here with detail is making some contrast to make it look like it's sharper. Okay, so that's the detail area. And then I'm going to go to optics. That one can be helpful if you want to use the profile corrections. It will identify what camera you had and what lens, and it will correct your image according to those lenses that you have on your camera or what camera you're using. So it identifies what it is, and it does some adjustments. So you can see that that's before with all the settings. That's after. That's what we have so far. It looks pretty good. All right, so I'm going to keep that one. And then some of the other ones, there's a lens blur. That's more an effect. So I'm going to, not go too much into that one because that's just creating a blur amount, for background. So that way you can see the people in focus, the background blurry, which is pretty cool. But I think that I rather want to go and explain that in Photoshop. But it is pretty interesting to play with that if you need it. So I'm going to not apply it. And then geometry and calibration, those are more advanced, so I'm going to do that later. But for now, the one thing that I want you all to try is to basically adjust the lightness, the color. You can play with the effects a little bit. Curve and color mixer, color grading. If you want to play with one, I would play with color grading because that one is more unique of Camera Raw. Details, that one is good to sharpening your images before you bring it to Photoshop. And then lastly, detail or optics. Okay. Now, I did a lot on this image. I want to show you the before and after. So again, that's before. That's where we're at right now. And that doesn't mean that when I go to Photoshop, I'm not going to edit this image even more. But the reason we want to use Camera Raw is that we have all that raw data that we're able to improve our image. Now we're going to convert it to JPEG, which is going to give you a way better file when you go to Photoshop to start working on your images or your design. If you're creating a design or something like that, you're basically working with a better image because you made changes before converting it to a smaller file size. Now, there are several things I want to show you, right? I did that on that image. I'm going to edit some of the other ones real quick so you can get an idea. But once you're done with an image, there's a couple options that you can do. One, you can click done. So I'm going to go here so you can see it at the bottom of my screen. You can hit done, you can hit open or cancel. Okay. Now, if I hit done, what that will do is it will close Camera Raw, and then the settings that I had on that file are going to get saved. Okay. So now that I'm here, you will see that it adjusted this image. Now it's brighter, and you can see this icon on the top right. The other ones don't have that icon. You can see that they're blank on the top right because I did nothing to them. The only one that I did was this one. Now, the cool thing about this is that now I can reopen it and then I can rechange the settings if I want to. Okay, so that was the first option. That was the done option. Now, if you want to open the image and I go in here and click open, what you will see that will happen is I will open the image inside Photoshop. So that's my image inside Photoshop. So now the problem is that I only had one selected. So it opens whatever you have selected. If you want to open all of the images in Adobe Photoshop, you have to make sure that you selected all of them. So I'm going to go back, not save this. I'm going to go back to Bridge. So now that I'm here, I'm going to basically double click all of the images again. I'm going to edit some of the other ones, and I'm going to show you other ways to save it. So I'm going to do this one quicker, these images. Maybe I'll do just two. So that way you can see some of the adjustments that can be done in Camera Raw. So again, we talked about that the images that are raw files gives you a lot more dynamic range, which means that you can basically push your file to become brighter and have more detail on the shadow area. So if I open this image, I'm going to get my highlights down. I'm going to make my shadows brighter, which is making this area here brighter. Okay. I'm going to make my whites a little bit darker. Blacks, I might leave them there. I'm going to make now my overall image a little bit brighter. So just by those settings, look at this area above here that you can see that there's more information now. I'm going to do it before and after so you can see. I'll move this to the side. That's before. You can see how dark it is. And then boom, this is now. That's just adjusting some of the settings here, which is improving my image dramatically before I take it into Photoshop. Now again, I lower my highlights because if I would just push the exposure high without having the highlights, I'm going to make everything to 0 so you can see the difference. If I go and do exposure only, you can see that, yeah, I get the detail up here, but look at the pool table, it's too bright, okay? So that's why I went back down on the highlights so I can bring some of that detail back down. On the highlights, obviously, I overdid this so you can see it. I wouldn't make it that bright. So I brought the highlights down, but I'm going to push my shadows up so I can see more of that detail, which doesn't affect this. And I'm going to bring my whites down a little bit. And then you do some of the other settings as, you know, the white balance. You can see if there's another one. That's the auto. I actually liked it a little bit more warmer, so I'm going to push this to the side so it's more yellow, somewhere on there. Clarity, I'm going to add some clarity to the image, maybe a little bit of grain to create an effect. And then let's see, color grading, I might make it a little bit warmer on the shadows. That looks looking good. That looks a little bit too warm right now actually for me, so I might even go back and change the color settings. And then sharpening, I'm going to add some sharpening with the masking. Remember, if I hold the option, I can see what's being sharpened now. So I just want that area. I don't want everything sharpened. And then let's see, what else do I want to adjust here? No, not detail. Optics, you want to change that. But I think that will be it for now. If you want to do, you know, the vignette, which on this image I don't think it needs this. I'm gonna not do it. But I'm gonna show you the before and after. But before I do that, I might make it a little bit cooler. The image somewhere on there. So that's the after. That's the before. So that's before. You can barely see any detail under the table or above the lamp. Then you bring this up and then you can see a lot more information. So that will give you a lot better image to work with. Now let me show you this one. I want to show you how it will look in black and white. You know, you have a black and white setting here, which is pretty cool. And you can adjust with the black and white mixer. I'm going to scroll down so you can see it. So again, I went up here at the top and I click on the black and white, which makes your image black and white. But then if you go down here to the black and white mixer, you can adjust the settings according to your image colors, which is pretty helpful because I know the sky was dark. So if I want my sky darker, I can just go to the blues and darken that. Look at that. That's pretty cool. Now I have my dark sky. Let me see what other color, maybe the aquas also. Yeah. Now this area here, I know it was kind of yellowish. So if I push the yellow, I can make that grass look whiter, which creates a nice contrast, which I think is pretty cool. Let's see the oranges. I can make the actual trees a little bit darker. That's looking pretty interesting already. Let's see the purple, what's affecting, not much. Magenta, let's see what's green. No, just that, which I can leave there. I think that looks pretty good. Now I'm gonna go back to light, and then I can retouch finally my image with some contrast, shadows a little bit darker, whites a little bit darker, some black, and then push the exposure. Okay, so let's see the before and after. So that's before, this is after. It looks way more dramatic, and you can actually make the contrast a little bit. Actually, this one would be a good one maybe for the haze. So if I go to dehaze, let's see how this looks. There you go, look at that. The sky gets darker because it has a lot of gray, so you can get a lot more detail. So there you go. This is just a black and white. We wanted to show you one really quickly so you can see that you can actually make an image black and white right in here in Camera Raw. And one other thing I want to show you of these color ones before I jump to these last three is that tool that I told you that you can use, which is at the color area. So let me minimize everything so you don't get confused. It's a little bit easy to see. So right now we are under the color tab, and we've talked about white balance, which is what the white balance that you selected, which means it's what light source is in your scene. And every scene has a different white balance option that you can pick from. So if you have tungsten lights, which are those, warm lights, filament light, that will give you a really yellow color. So if you pick tungsten, it will neutralize the colors for that type of light. If you shoot daylight, it will have a different effect. So in this one, what I want to do, instead of picking, you know, through the settings, I actually want to click on this little white balance tool, because if you click there, it gives you this tool that wherever you click, assuming that it is an area that is either neutral or white, that it has no color shift, it will neutralize your image according to that color. However, this scene right here, I know that there's these white poles, but the reality is that these white poles might not be neutral, might be an off-white, but it will give you at least a starting point of adjusting your image. So if I click here, you can see that the colors change, right? So I'm going to see the before and after. That's how it was before, but because I had this tool and I click here, I'm telling the computer, hey, this area here should be white. And then it basically adjusts the colors according to that message that I sent, that, hey, this should be white. So if this is white, then all the colors get adjusted according to that. Now, in this case, it kind of works. It's still not perfect. You have other areas that might be, neutral, that you can click through and then see what it does. You see this one is too warm. You have this dish here that looks gray, but that's okay job actually. So you have to kind of navigate, through your image and find something that you think that it should have been neutral, or meaning gray or a white area, that doesn't have a color shift. Now, I mentioned that it might not be perfect, but at least it's close enough. And then you can go to the slider and decide, you know what, it was supposed to be a little bit cooler because it was like after sunset. Or if you want it warmer, you can push it to the right and find that sweet spot. So let's see the before and after. So that was before, it had a blue shift and cyan shift over the image. And then now, after I made an adjustment, it looks more natural to what it should be. And that's a pretty cool tool, and that's really helpful because if you were shooting JPEG in your camera and then you take it to Photoshop and the colors are off, it's a little bit trickier to neutralize the image. You can still do it, but here it's way simpler because you're dealing with the raw data and you can make those changes before converting it to the JPEG. Now, let's say that I wanted to save these images from this one all the way to the first one. Basically what I did is I click on this one and then I hold shift and then click on this one. Let's say that I'm done with these. I still want to work on these last three here, but let's say that I want to be done with these ones and I want to save them as JPEGs. One of the cool things that Camera Raw can do is that I can process these, save them as JPEG without even opening them in Photoshop. Okay. You can double click right now on these images. It will open this 5 images in Photoshop, but I don't want to do that right now. I just want to save them. So you can either click this little icon. So I don't know if you notice that when I have my mouse over an image, this appears and it has this little icon right here that you will also find on the top of the screen here. It's this one right here. That is basically to process your images or save them. So if I click there, this menu will appear. And you can select the destination. Where do you want to save it? So destination, save in same location. And you can select the folder by going here. If you want a different one, you can change, the naming of the file to whatever you want. Right now it has the document name. And then the cool thing now is that I can change the format. So right now I can leave it as a digital negative, or I can click here and change it as a JPEG. I can change it as a TIFF or Photoshop, which in this case, most of the time when you're here, you probably want to change it to a JPEG, okay? Unless you know that you're going to be printing or doing something that requires a lot of big file information. You can change it to a TIFF, which is a file that does not lose image quality, or a Photoshop file. If so, anything that's like really important that you're going to print big or something like that, you want to work on these two files. For most of the cases, like 80% of your files, you probably just want to be on JPEG. So that's the file that you want. The other thing that you do once you change it to JPEG, make sure that you change the quality, okay, instead of high to maximum, okay? So want to make sure that you have maximum quality here. And then you can also resize your file, but we're not going to do that. On the bottom here, right now, the only thing we want to do is change it to a JPEG, okay? And then you hit click save, and it will process your images and save them in that folder location that you selected here, and save them as JPEG, which is pretty cool. Now, I'm not going to do that because I want to actually show you this last step right here with these 3 images. So these 3 images, I shot them on purpose on the studio because I want to show you that inside Camera Raw, you can also synchronize your files at once. So what that means is that if I select these 3 files, or even if I select all of them, but I'm going to select these 3 and I adjust, the 3 of them at the same time, all of them will change, which is pretty cool because you can do a group of images edits at once. However, you don't have to do that necessarily. You can also just edit one and then synchronize those files. And that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to fix this one. 2 things only. I'm going to change the color of this image, and I'm going to maybe brighten up or darken it a little bit. I'm not going to do a lot of things. Now, the cool thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the color to show you that white balance tool again. I have it selected. Okay, I click on that, and I'm going to go to this card. This card is called the company's Y-Bal. You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it in B&H Photo, Adorama, Sammy's Camera. They sell in every photography store. But what it does is it's guaranteeing you that this card is neutral, that doesn't have any shift in color. So if you pick the gray balance tool or the white balance tool and you click here on the gray card, it's telling the computer, look, this light source was hitting this card and this card should look neutral. So when you click there, it fixes the color according to that information that you're giving the computer, and it fixes all the colors for you. The cool thing about this is that then you don't have to guess the settings of like the color, like, oh, it needs to be warmer or cooler, is it quite there? It's just taking all the guessing away and guaranteeing you that according to that light source, if you click here, it's making the colors correct. So after I do that, I can synchronize it with this image, which is a product shot, and then I know that the colors are going to be precise. Okay, so if you're shooting advertising or anything like a product, or you're doing a portrait and you want the skin of the person or the product like this one to have accurate color, you can take all that guessing away by just having this on your setting. On the first image, you take a picture of it, then you take the white balance tool, this one, and you click on it and it fixes the color for you. All right, so I'm going to do that. Then I'm going to do some simple editing. I'm going to make the highlights a little bit lower, maybe raise the exposure. Nothing of this is like necessary, but I'm just doing it so we can do something. Now I'm going to select these 3 images by pressing shift and clicking on this one. And after, you can see that here you have this little icon again that appears in all your files, but this one on the bottom, this one was to save, but this one underneath is basically to synchronize your file. So I'm going to click that one, and what it does is opens the synchronize window, which you can select all the things that you want to synchronize. In this case, it doesn't matter because I only did 2 things, the white balance and some light, but I'm going to make sure that all of them are selected so I don't forget anything. I'm going to press OK. So what that will do is it changed the settings of this image as well. So if I go here and you see under exposure and the highlights and shadow now has the same adjustments that I did for my other image, and it also has white balance, has the custom, which is the one that I pick for it. Okay, so that's a pretty cool thing because now I can basically synchronize 100 images, 1,000 images. If they're all shot in the same scenario and the lighting was the same, I can basically adjust them all at once, which is a pretty cool thing for Camera Raw to do. So that way you can just focus later in Photoshop on just creating your composite or adjusting more regional adjustments instead of global stuff. So that is Camera Raw in a nutshell. Okay, so I went really quickly because I wanted to focus on going into Photoshop, But I do think that it's important that you recognize the importance of Camera Raw, because it's better to start with good images inside Photoshop than to, try to make everything work in Photoshop when you're already dealing with a JPEG format or a file format that doesn't have a lot of dynamic range like a raw file format. In here, we were able to change the white balance, change all the information of the lightness of your image before you go to Photoshop. So that way, then later, you can just minimal adjustments inside Photoshop. So that is Camera Raw. I hope it makes sense. What you're going to have to do for this labs is I'm going to give you several images. You're going to process them according to the steps that I showed you, of course. All of you are going to have different numbers. You're going to adjust it to whatever you think feels right to you. And then you're also going to process these images where you have to synchronize them to make sure that the white balance is correct, okay? So I hope that this is helpful. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out. Once we're done with Camera Raw, then we're going to dive into Photoshop and learn some fun stuff. So I hope to see you soon. Take care and have a great day.